Indian media has been under question for a few years now. The raids on media houses, arrests of journalists, draconian laws, and biased reporting are just some of the problems that grapple the fourth pillar of democracy. These issues were highlighted as India ranked 159th on the World Press Freedom Index 2024, released by Reporters Without Borders. It's two positions above last year, where India ranked 161. India is behind Turkey, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and even Palestine this year. The RSF report mentioned that some countries' rise in the index was misleading as they were the result of fails by countries previously above them. Now, what does this mean for Indian media? Where does Indian journalism stand? Is India really unworthy of democracy, as the report claims? Joining us today is Maya Sharma, a senior journalist who has over 3 decades of experience. Let us talk to her to understand the state of media in today's time. Firstly, thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today and talking about our media. And as the report has come out of the World Press Freedom, the first thing that I want to ask is, of course, your opinion about India's position at 159th this year.
Well, 159 is marginally better than it was last time round, but it's still not a great number. It's certainly not a great number when it comes to ranking of press freedom in what is considered the world's largest democracy. We did hope we'd have done better at this stage. Yes, it is getting better. Let's hope it does get better in the future as well, but not good enough. Not good enough for sure.
And how do you view this? Because Palestine has been ranked at 157, which is something that's surprising everybody. Also, in fact, even the report had clearly mentioned that India's rank is not because of its performance, but rather because the other country's performance has gone down. How, like, what would you say about Indian media at this current? Because it looks like the government has not taken any action if we just go by the reports.
Well, I certainly do think that Indian media houses are not as free as perhaps they once were. I think that the importance of media freedom in a democracy cannot be overestimated, cannot be overemphasized, because information is power, information is knowledge, and the people have every right to know what is going on. And anything that curbs this freedom of the press, freedom of the media, is something to be really concerned about. And I do think there has been a change. I do think that things are not as free as they should be for the media. I think it's become harder to actually operate as independent media houses in the country today. I think that's true.
Also, you've worked in this industry for decades. Earlier, there were different challenges. There was a time when media restrictions were there. What are the changes that you've clearly seen that might have led to this ranking from your experience?
Yes, I mean, it's not as if things were always brilliant for media in India. It's not as if things suddenly changed overnight or anything like that. There has always been a possibility of room for improvement when it comes to media freedom, because let's face it, those in power do not necessarily want a total free media. They do not want to be criticized. They don't want to be called to account. And this is true, I'm saying, across political parties. Whoever is in power does not really want to have their work and their projects and their contracts examined too closely by the media. That is true. That has always been true. But if you're talking about the last 10 years, I think there's been a lot of polarization within the media itself. I think I'm talking about a section of the media. What I'm familiar with, especially, is, say, television journalism, English television journalism. I think you're finding very much that it's what is happening in media houses is that they're on one side or the other, which is very sad. Now, of course, it's always been true that media houses were owned by, say, big businesses or by people with a certain political leaning. That has always been the case. But I think more now than perhaps, say, 10 years ago, it is very clear which side a media house is on, which is very unfortunate, because we talk about journalism being without bias. We're talking about journalism being without, obviously, showing who you are. A reporter does vote, yes, but a reporter is not the story. The views of the reporter is not the story. Journalism should be as objective as possible. But I think of late, in the last 10 years or more recently, it's like you're on one side or you're on the other side. You're with us or you're against us. And that, I think, is a big change. Another big change has been in the technology, the way people access news. And why this is important when it comes to press freedom is that people are getting their news on their phones, they're getting it anywhere they are. And it's not always that the news is authentic news, that it's true. A lot of it is fake news. We have our WhatsApp university, we have unverified forwards going out, you have a flood in another country being represented as a flood in India. So technology has also impacted the way we talk about media and media freedom and media responsibility, that people can get their, and people are producing reports. We have journalists everywhere. Everybody with a mobile phone is a journalist. That means there's not that quality check, that veracity, that journalistic training is not going into people who actually make those reports. And this is, I think, another big change. This technology change is also impacting the veracity of the media, the way people view how truthful media is.
The consumption of the news by the people. Also, one of the major comparisons that we do with media right now is with the time of during the emergency, because at least we have known that media was stopped completely there, and now also we have cases, especially let's talk about Manipur or Kashmir. Whenever there is something, we have seen that media is completely banned whenever there is a volatile situation in the country. Um, how do you see the stark connection between these two incidents? And do you think that is the comparison really that bad? Have we gone to that level, especially with the laws also coming in, the three laws that came by? Is the comparison okay to make, firstly?
Well, of course, the emergency was extreme. It was very dire. We've had famous cases like the Indian Express with its blank editorial. That was extreme. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was not working at that time, of course, so I didn't experience it firsthand. But of course, as you mentioned, the reference keeps coming up. We hear people who are worried about press freedom talking about this being an undeclared emergency, which is perhaps a little more worrying, because at least in an emergency, you know when it's formally been declared, and the implication is that it will end at some stage. But if there is an undeclared emergency, as some people claim, then that becomes a little more difficult, because people may not feel the ability to be free with their reporting, to be free with what they write in editorials. But it's not as if there's anything in writing to say you're not supposed to say this, you're not supposed to do that. It's like case by case. And we've had several high profile cases where journalists have found themselves in trouble for doing something as basic as, say, reporting both sides of the story. We've had, like you mentioned in Kashmir as well, journalists being jailed for talking about this point of view and this point of view. And there are, of course, at least two sides to every story. And a sincere journalist has to give at least two sides. I mean, there are more, of course, but
that's the job description that comes with it.
Yes. So to do that, and then you're in trouble because you've given. I'm not talking about platforming hate or giving a voice to people who don't deserve to be heard out loud. In fact, there has been recent criticism also, some journalists interviewing people who may have cases against them. But you have to look at both sides. And if a journalist is punished for doing their job, then that is not okay.
And now that is worrying, the fact that people are calling this as undeclared emergency right now. And now, how do you also see the coverage of the elections, especially because earlier, even in the parliamentary proceedings, let's say, because earlier, a decade ago, we had the trend of parliamentary reporting. That was a special beat that was anyway available. And now we barely see journalists who have that beat in their portfolio itself. How do you see the differences in those, and especially this current election reporting?
Well, coming to the parliament, of course, it's very disturbing in one way, because as you said earlier, people could go in, even inside the assembly, state assemblies, the parliament as well. We could actually take our cameras in. Now, what is more common is that there's a feed, a common feed that comes out, which means that media houses are dependent on what feed is being provided. And as we saw in some of the conflicts in parliament recently, the cameras would be only on, say, the ruling party. You would not see any protest from the other side. You would not see what was happening. And quite literally, mics might be muted at a time when an opposition member was speaking. So that is sad, because especially when it comes to parliament, these are people that we have elected, that the people of India have elected, and they're speaking in the parliament house. So it should be unfiltered, unedited. There will, of course, always be a taking this shot over this shot, and there will be production differences as well as to what is being shown. But when it comes to an editorial decision to show something or not show something, to let something be seen by the people or not be seen by the people, heard or not heard, that is worrying. So that does seem to have increased of late in terms of the censorship almost of what comes out of Parliament. That is a matter of concern.
That's right.
And the coverage of the elections. You also spoke about the coverage of elections. Yes, I do think, because right now there are so many different ways we're receiving the news. TV news, especially news which perhaps TV channels which seem to own their loyalty to the establishment, they're probably showing only one side. They're debating only certain cases. They're talking about certain issues. But there are many other ways you can get news, whether it's online, whether it's YouTube or online news channels, news portals. There are many other ways. So I'm not giving a blanket thing saying that nobody's saying anything critical of the government or calling authority to account. It is happening. But if you're looking at what we call the mainstream media, the main news channels in English especially, then I think there may be questions as to what kind of coverage is coming out, how critically people in power are interviewed. Whether is it a proper interview or is it a kind of soft peddling of questions? Are questions cleared in advance? I mean, those are things which are being raised.
Also, when we talk about the way the news is being reported, we also see this trend that algorithm plays now. It's like you consume whatever you want to consume, and the algorithm is going to show you the same things. So there's no way that you have access to other side of the story or other media houses that might show the other point of view or at least not be that biased. And that again depends a lot on the consumer rather than the journalist to give that. And second thing is that I want to ask you about is right now we see a trend where politicians give interviews to content creators, podcasters, and not journalists per se. We have seen the changes in the way the interview happens, of course, but how do you see that as a senior journalist when such things happen? And what are the implications of these things, especially when it comes to politicians?
Well, it's always been that politicians have not always been accessible to everybody. They would most prefer to be interviewed by somebody who would be sympathetic to them or not ask the hard questions. We've seen many famous examples of the politician removing the mic and walking away when questions have become uncomfortable. Now we're seeing politicians making sure they're not put into situations that might become uncomfortable. They're avoiding interviews altogether. And that is, of course, a matter of concern because the leaders are answerable to the people. And the journalist is traditionally the voice of the public, getting answers, getting access to places which the public cannot. People can't just walk up to a leader perhaps and talk to them. A journalist should be able to. The ordinary member of the public may not have access to certain offices or certain bureaucrats, which a journalist does. So when there is that kind of barrier, when there is a kind of picking and choosing as to who somebody would speak to, that does become very unfortunate.
And because usually these podcasts have a very high viewership, which is again a very surprising thing, and they have a very soft approach, and it usually happens during an election that such videos come out. It influences the people's mind. What would you say to the consumers who are consuming such content, when they take this as a piece of journalism and not as a piece of content per se? What would be a message to them?
It's again that whole that whole business, like you mentioned, the algorithms. They're seeing what they want to see, and it's always been that some people might take this paper because it kind of reflects their views. People will not take that paper because they find it too right or too left or whatever. That has always been the case. We do tend to operate in echo chambers of our own. We do tend to read material or watch a channel that to some extent does reflect what we say. But there was always the option of other ideas coming in, other viewpoints coming in. Now with algorithms, if I'm searching for something, if I want to know the name of Virat Kohli and Anushka's baby, and I ask for that, they'll give me all the baby names of all the film stars. I mean, it's like, it's not as if I'm looking for it, but whether it's something light like that or it's something serious like that, if you're looking for, unfortunately, say a kind of a hate trend, you'll be getting only that. So the algorithms, again, is part of the technology that I mentioned, the change in technology over the last 10 years. So that is definitely a matter of concern. I mean, I'm sure that there are several good podcasters out there. There are several good people who are running YouTube channels, definitely, for sure. It's not like a blanket thing. But there are certainly some who do see it as, even traditional journalists do, see their job as a way of gaining influence, of gaining access to policymakers, which is not quite journalism, in my opinion. It's a way of projecting yourself or getting yourself a certain amount of power by being close to those in power. That is unfortunate, but it's not just podcasters today. It's happened earlier as well, with even in traditional journalism.
Also, in a way, do you think that today, doing journalism today or practicing journalism is dangerous, especially for the newcomers?
The people, the youngsters who are entering the industry will, at least for some years, they'll be unlikely to be put in situations that are tricky. As entrants into the industry, they are likely to be less exposed to very senior people or to very tricky situations. There would hopefully be a certain amount of breaking in, a certain amount of training on the job, a certain amount of looking around before they're put in difficult situations. But definitely for middle level and senior level journalists, I think there is a certain amount of questioning, a certain amount of, you have to accept that some things you can say, some things you can't say, unless you're ready to face the consequences. And it's unfortunate that these consequences are there. But what happens, I think another very dangerous thing apart from outside censorship, is self-censorship. When journalists themselves feel, yeah, maybe I'd better not say that. Maybe I might lose my job or get into trouble, or I may get pressure, or another pressure on journalists. I may lose access to that source. If I say something very much against what that person says, they may not talk to me again. And access is a key feature of journalism. So there are many different factors, many different levels at which this operates, but it's tricky. Let's just say it's complicated. It's a little more complicated when there is a question over media freedom. It becomes more complicated.
And what were the challenges you faced earlier, which, probably we are not facing it now? And also, what are the challenges that you feel that journalists today face across all the levels, senior, entry level, and, high, medium level?
Earlier, I think the challenges were logistical. Getting from point A to point B, you had to physically get there, like we're talking now in different places. Earlier, you would have to come to where I am, or I'd have to come to where you are. It's a reality. I mean, that would be a big challenge in a city like Bengaluru. Like, it's a very basic challenge, but it's a real challenge. And it would not, as a television journalist, it would not be just me. It would be my camera person, a sound recordist, a lighting assistant, a person to drive all of us. It would be a huge logistical challenge just to get from point A to point B, to get that short quote, to get that short bite. That was a huge challenge. Transmitting what we got, we would have to either go back to the place where we could uplink through satellite, like this. We're doing this you may be on your laptop, I'm on a phone. It's like it's technically much easier, and your generation, the younger generation, may actually take that for granted. Like, you need to talk to somebody, yes, you dial them up, that kind of thing. That has changed a lot. That I think is easier for journalism today. But also it needs to be done with care, because a conversation is one thing, but when you're reporting about a situation on the ground, you can't dilute it. You have to be there. You really have to be there. I think that was access is more of a challenge these days as well, because in this polarized media world, you find that you may have access to one set of politicians or leaders, but not the other. And that is something which has increased over the last few years. In earlier years, when I started off and in the middle of my career, even if people didn't agree with the policies or the politics or the lack of politics of your channel, they would speak to you. But later on, it became harder and harder to get representatives of some political parties to actually talk. So that is a growing challenge. That was a growing challenge. Right now, it's in a state of flux. It really depends on which media house you're representing, what seem to be the politics of that media house. So that is another very big challenge, which people are facing today at all levels.
Also, looking ahead, what are the prospects that you see in the field of journalism in India?
I am hopeful. I would like to be hopeful. In fact, today was a convocation day for students I'm teaching. And as they set off into this journalism world in India, it is a difficult time now. I'm not saying it's not difficult. There is, like, as we've been talking about, a certain diminishing of the amount of freedom, of the amount of things that people can say and who they can say it to. But I'm hoping that as things go in phases, perhaps this is the low phase, maybe things will start getting better. And the youngsters who are coming in need to come in with that hope, with that aspiration. You know, journalists of your age must hope that we can make the difference, we can make it better. You know, things do go in cycles. So let's hope that there's an upcycle now, because in many ways things are pretty bad right now. So I think things can only get better.
So there's a lot of hope for new journalists. Also, any last message for the consumers, of course, as well as journalists?
For consumers, have a certain sense of doubt, have a certain sense of skepticism. Don't believe everything that comes to you in a WhatsApp forward. Don't believe everything you read. I'm talking about both sides of the left, the right. Don't take everything that you see in print or online as the absolute truth. Question the source from which it is coming, question the motivation. There is more work needed for a news consumer now than there was perhaps in the old days, because of the polarization we talked about. As journalists, just be true to the calling, just be true to what you're supposed to do. Be careful about the traps of closeness to those in power, feeling that, yes, I have access because I'm doing what that person asks. Be careful of that. Remember that journalism is about providing information to, it's become a cliche, but being the voice of the voiceless, of making positive changes, not just not just accepting without question what is happening. We have to make a change. Yes, we have to be unbiased, but that doesn't mean we should not actively seek to make a bad situation better. That has to be done. That is a very important thing for journalists to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.